Wow, isn't that wonderful? I welcome all of you to the YWCA Stand Against Racism Lunch and Learn. This month, we are looking at the power of music, and we have a really somewhat different but delightful presentation for you today. As many of you may be aware, music serves as a vehicle that to this day continues to drive the civil rights movement. Music has been a life force to those marginalized, to help those of us who need to dream, who need to overcome, have that power. Today, we will visit how music has served to be a voice for the voiceless, the strength for those that often had no other support. Then, with the artistic flair, we will take a journey of discovery of how music has helped shape the movement. Today, helping us to see this vision are Dr. Yvonne Kendall, an internationally recognized musicologist and public scholar, Patrick Dailey, performing artist and educator at Tennessee State University, and Dr. Marquita Reed-Wrigh, collections manager of the National Museum of African American Music. We will start our program now.
This is for the Pullman Porters, who organized when people said they couldn't, and carried the Pittsburgh Courier and the Chicago Defender to the African Americans in the South so that they would know that they were not alone.
This is for the Pullman Porters who helped Thurgood Marshall go south and come back north to fight the fight that resulted in Brown versus Board of Education. Because even though Kansas is west, and even though Topeka is the birthplace of Gwendolyn Brooks, who wrote the powerful The Chicago Defender Sends a Man to Little Rock, it was the Pullman Porters who whispered to the traveling men, both the blues men and the race men, so that they both would know what was going on.
This is for the Pullman Porters who smiled as if they were happy and laughed like they were tickled when some folks were around, and who silently rejoiced in 1954 when the Supreme Court announced its 9-0 decision that separate is inherently unequal.
This is for the Pullman Porters who smiled and welcomed a 14-year-old boy onto their train in 1955. They noticed his slight limp that he tried to disguise with a doo-wop walk. They noticed his stutter and probably understood why his mother wanted him out of Chicago during the summer when school was out. 14-year-old Black boys with limps and stutters are apt to try to prove themselves in dangerous ways when mothers aren't around to look after them.
So this is for the Pullman Porters who looked over that 14-year-old while the train rolled the reverse of the Blues Highway from Chicago to St. Louis to Memphis to Mississippi. This is for the men who kept him safe. And if Emmett Till had been able to stay on a train all summer, he would have maybe grown a bit of a paunch, certainly lost his hair, probably have worn bifocals and bounced his grandchildren on his knee, telling them about his summer riding the rails. But he had to get off the train and ended up in Money, Mississippi, and was horribly, brutally, inexcusably, and unacceptably murdered.
This is for the Pullman porters who, when the sheriff was trying to get the body secretly buried, got Emmett's body on the northbound train, got his body home to Chicago, where his mother said, "I want the world to see what they did to my boy." And this is for all the mothers who cried, and this is for all the people who never said again. This is about the moment Rosa Parks shouldered her cross, put her worldly goods aside, was willing to sacrifice her life so that the young man in Money, Mississippi, who had been so well protected by the Pullman porters, would not have died in vain. Great voices would be raised, singing the praises of God and exhorting to us to forgive those who trespass against us.
But it was the Pullman porters who safely got Emmett to his grand uncle, and it was Mrs. Rosa Parks who could not stand that death. And in not being able to stand, she sat back down.
America's commitment to entwined values of freedom and equality was being loudly questioned. These questions were being asked politely by Martin Luther King Jr. and less so by Malcolm X. Marches, speeches, sit-ins, legislation as the civil rights movement began to have notable successes. Hope, to paraphrase activist Jesse Jackson, was definitely alive. This hope was reflected in the new musical style that took the here and now ethos of gospel, the positive messages of the era, and the short, accessible phrasing of emerging popular music. Artists like Ray Charles were criticized for combining religious and secular music styles, but the good news train had left the station. It could not be stopped.
This new style, soul, was based in part on a reclamation of African roots. Soul music was part of a desire to feel pride in the past of African Americans through respect for the traditions and research into its ancestry. Wearing hair in natural styles was one way of showing respect and pride in the Africanness of African Americans. Using the word Black as a compliment was another. Treasuring the poetry, visual arts, and music was yet another. The Black arts amplified the greatest flourishing of African-American writers and painters since the Harlem Renaissance. The first courses in African-American music developed during this period. Major universities like Harvard hired their first African-American faculty, and some accepted their first Black students. Soul was the first African-American music that was almost uniformly positive in its message, even though it was born in the Vietnam era. Spirituals had proclaimed the victory when Joshua fit the Battle of Jericho. Blues accepted hard times as the norm. Unlike gospel, which often spoke of trials and tribulations, asking that their precious Lord take my hand, even if there were confidence they would be resolved, soul had a bold message of self-respect, Black pride, and humor.
At the same time, traditional spirituals and freedom songs continued their age-old role of nourishing the souls who fought freedom and justice. Grounded in a profound and cultural need to release tension and to contain hope in coded language, these songs became increasingly as bold as the new music that sprouted from the same roots. The Reverend Jesse Jackson, who would later become a presidential candidate briefly, coined the poignant phrase shouted by many Black children in the call and response style common to the old slave songs. I am somebody. That African Americans had to assert such a basic fact is the clearest indication of where America was as a nation. But Jackson also coined the phrase, keep hope alive. One way to keep hope alive was to sing together. As the late John Lewis lamented, without singing, we would have lost our sense of solidarity.
Well, freedom riders updated spirituals to reflect the updated drive for equality. James Brown encouraged African Americans to say it loud, I'm Black and I'm proud. A perfect example of updating spirituals is one of the most famous freedom songs, Oh, freedom. Here is the original, followed by its update.
Oh, what preaching! Oh, what preaching! Oh, what preaching over me! Before I'd be a slave, I'd be buried in my grave and go home to my Lord and be saved. Oh, freedom, oh, freedom, oh, freedom over me, and before I'd be a slave, I'd be buried in my grave and go home to my Lord and be free.
The complementary goals of determination, self-sufficiency found in these freedom songs were reflected in Brown's rules for his band members and a system of fines for infractions like being late to rehearsal, not knowing the music or dance steps, and being impaired by alcohol or drugs at rehearsal. The fines were then used to finance band parties. His work ethic resulted in tight performances that traveled throughout the South and later moved into other parts of the US, eventually landing on television in the age when NBC, CBS, ABC, and National Public Television were the only options. According to Eva Dolan, writer for the Chicago Daily Defender, June 13th, 1964,
the amazing talent of Brown stands out from all the rest. He weeps the blues into a flaming torch and in a breathless change of pace swings his magic into a bouncing, rollicking song explosion of the power and blaze of an atomic blast-off.
The Godfather of Soul became the Godfather of a nation. When Washington was near chaos after the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., James Brown jetted to our nation's capital and broadcast via television to a bereaved and embittered people.
I'm not a speech maker. I'm not a writer, but I can tell you what's happening. I'm a man. Nobody can buy me. I can do what I want. I say what I want because this is America. A man can get ahead here. Through you, I got ahead. I've been able to say what I want to say. I say to you, get off the streets. Go home. Take your families home.
And they went home. In Boston, less than 24 hours after the death, the mayor convinced him to go ahead with his scheduled concert to help him keep the peace. Years later, his funeral was broadcast worldwide as the hardest working man in show business took his final rest. While Soul Brother #1 was training his band, freedom riders were training their band of activists in techniques of nonviolent resistance. The same self-discipline demanded by James Brown was demanded by the leaders of Nashville's civil rights community. Led by James Lawson, they then head of the Nashville Christian Leadership Conference, and Reverend Kelly Miller Smith, its founder. Some training was held in Mount Eagle, Tennessee, at the Highlander School, where songs of protest were taught. The revered John Lewis attended and said it was the first time he had ever seen Black and white people sitting down together to eat, but also cleaning up together afterwards. According to Nashville's own freedom writer, Rip Patton, we learned a lot of songs. Our group was known as a singing movement because music is very important in the movement. Because when something happens to you, there's always a song for it.
So music, again, is very important to us. During one of the stand-ins at the movie theater, there was a young lady, a young white man walked up to her, smoking a cigarette, and he was puffing and getting that cigarette just as red as he could. And he told this black girl, he says, "I'm gonna put this cigarette out in your face." So her friend was behind her and said, "I'll put my hand up to your face and you can burn my hand and not your face." And So she said, no, he's not going to burn me. So within her soul, she started singing, ain't gonna let no cigarette turn me around, turn me around, turn me around, ain't gonna let no cigarette turn me around. I'm gonna keep on a walking, keep on a talking, marching up to freedom land. Young man dropped the cigarette and walked away.
The Nashville Activists were led by students at historically Black institutions, Fisk, Meharry, Tennessee State, then Tennessee A&I, and American Baptist College, then American Baptist Theological Seminary. After the first successful lunch counter sit-in, the Black religious community of Nashville endorsed this nonviolent effort. But not all efforts were publicly proclaimed. Artists like Aretha Franklin played their own role in the music of the civil rights era.
Aretha Franklin was the daughter of a traveling preacher in great demand. When record producers for Columbia heard her voice, they signed her and then spent some time trying to figure out how to use her talent. From jaunty country renditions of Rockabye Your Baby with the Dixie Melody to the jazzy My Funny Valentine. Finally, following the model of Ray Charles, they bowed to the inevitable, letting her do what came naturally as an accomplished singer and pianist. The rest is history. Her powerful yet controlled voice could swing from delicate soft notes to commanding field holler yells, from the R&B moaning to proud soul assertion. In a move that was rare, even in progressive 60s, she was backed up at one time on one of her greatest R&B hits by British guitarist Eric Clapton and Muscle Shoals, Alabama phenom Dwayne Allman. In the 70s, she worked with legendary producer Quincy Jones, and in the 80s, when her career was thought to be flagging, she had a smash hit with I Knew You'd Be Waiting, a duo featuring another Brit, George Michael. In 1987, she became the very first woman inducted into the US Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Later, in 2005, 4 decades after she started her career, she was inducted into the UK Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Her career revived once more when she won a Grammy for Never Gonna Break My Faith, a 2008 duo with R&B diva Mary J. Blige. In fact, she remained in variety throughout her career, releasing gospel albums, a cover of the Rolling Stones' Jumping Jack Flash, and even singing Nessun Dorma from Giacomo Puccini's famed opera Turandot.
Aretha was one of the host of women, like Nashville's soft-spoken Diane Nash, who played a less well-publicized role in the movement.
Especially since there had been violence. Everyone understood that to take up the freedom ride meant there was a good possibility of serious danger that I could get. And in my capacity as coordinator, several of the people getting on the bus gave me sealed envelopes that I was to mail.
The Queen of Soul's enduring hit, Respect, shows how music of the era adapted to the needs of the people for singable, memorable songs. It had the standard soul and freedom song attributes of short phrases and a positive message, but also includes popular colloquialisms like TCB for taking care of business, a jazz sax solo, and a gospel vamp of improvising over Sock It To Me. Although written and recorded by Otis Redding, it took Aretha's talent to realize the song's full potential. She first met Dr. King when she was in her teens and even sang at his funeral. King's daughter, Bernice, recognized her as a shining example of how to use the arts to support social change, further noting that Franklin is, as a daughter of the movement, not only used her voice to entertain, but to uplift and inspire generations through songs that have become anthems. She did more than sing. She finally supported several civil rights She financially supported civil rights campaigns. She fundraised for the movement. She housed activists, and she even had a clause in her contract that forbade singing for a segregated audience. In 2015, President Barack Obama said,
"Nobody embodies more fully the connection between the African-American spiritual, the blues, R&B, rock and roll, the way that hardship and sorrow were transformed into something full of beauty and vitality and hope."
Since then, those of us who remain do our parts. There are many powerful ways to fight racism through nonviolent action and hope. As a musicologist, I have the honor of preserving and interpreting our history in reference books that make it available to scholars as the basis for further research. For too long, our story has been told by those who, however skilled and well-meaning, have lacked the personal experience living with the music in its vital cultural context. But then came scholars like Eileen Southern, the first African-American to teach African-American music at Harvard. She wrote The Music of Black Americans. Samuel Floyd wrote The Power of Black Music. Tammy Kernodle, Emmett Price, and Horace Maxfield co-edited the 3-volume Encyclopedia of African American Music, to which I was honored to make 3 entries. Dr. Kernodle is now president of the highly respected Society for American Music. My contribution, our contributions, reveal links between academia, art, and activism, garnering the respect our history deserves in building a more perfect union. We stand against racism by spreading knowledge of our music.
as a museum professional, I present the visual and oral evidence of art and activism through exhibit making, this honored history available to all people of all ages. NAMM strives to educate the world, preserve the legacy, and celebrate the central role African Americans play in creating the American soundtrack. It is the only museum dedicated to educating, preserving, and celebrating more than 50 music genres and styles that were created, influenced, and are inspired by African Americans, using artifacts, objects, memorabilia, clothing, and state-of-the-art technology. Each of the museum's galleries is designed to show different narratives and unique perspectives on African American music and history. The museum tells a story of how the artistic impact of a distinct group of people changed the world. Visitors explore how music served as a way for African Americans to create and preserve the unique American narrative. We stand against racism by preserving the truth of our history.
As a classically trained singer, I continue the profound tradition of showcasing the Black aesthetic and the Western canon while upholding some of the most notable and early traditions of African American music. We work to properly contextualize our music in the broader landscape of the world's great music. The Negro spiritual, once thought too lowly for the concert stage, was championed by icons and activists such as Paul Robeson, Marian Anderson, Robert McFerrin, and Roland Hayes. This tradition, initiated by the likes of Harry T. Burleigh and Nashville's own Fifth Jubilee singers, led to the development of the African American art song, choral music, and opera. Additionally, many of us in the classical performance world serve in various capacities to nurture Black creativity by educating, training, and mentoring the next generation of leaders in the field, often focusing on historically Black institutions like Fisk, Tennessee State, Morgan State, Tuskegee, and Morehouse. We are committed to flourishing as our full selves, from the opera house to the church house and everywhere in between. We stand against racism by singing from our hearts, elevating our music to stand beside any music anywhere for all time.
And now we open the floor for questions. There was one video that I did want to show. I'm gonna find it and then back up because I think it'll be interesting to you. This is in the story that we were telling, I just found this last night in the story we were telling about James Brown being asked to help calm things down in Washington, D.C. He was also asked to calm things down in Boston, where he already had a concert scheduled the day after Martin Luther King was assassinated. And here's some information about that.
First, we got to pay our respect to the late, great, incomparable, somebody we love very much, somebody I have all the admiration in the world for. I got a chance to know him personally, the late, great Mr. Martin Luther King.
He was a lover of Martin Luther King Jr., just as James is actually quite a patriot. He's a lover of America. You know, he called Martin America's best friend. It's one of the most powerful formulations of Martin in a way.
I want to say this. Now, in the city, I know the mayor asked people to stay home and stay off the street because for the safety of the city.
Everybody was tense, but Mr. Brown had a tough crew and they were going to do their job. But I mean, you're human and you didn't know what was going to go on.
What must it have been like for James Brown to go on that stage? I wonder if he was in fear of his life. This was the days before metal detectors. You could have brought anything into that show. That was heroic for him to do that.
If he was afraid, you did not know it. You didn't know it. They weren't going to let you see that.
I never met anything like James Brown. I never saw anything like James Brown. Man, he was a piece of work.
Okay, there's a question for Patrick. You are active in classical music, opera, and particularly Baroque music. Can you describe what your current focus in within those areas and what projects you are particularly excited about right now?
Certainly. I think that one of the things that often happens, as I sort of said in my final statement, my work often is about, sort of centering Black music, and not just, the Black music of America, but pretty much Black world music, Black global music throughout the diaspora, within the context of the history of all world music, right? And so what often ends up happening is we put everything, particularly in Western musical and artistic study, we put everything within this box of, well, it's, early, it's antiquity, it's Baroque, or early, it's Renaissance, keep going down, down, down. And then finally, there is this other chapter on the side. Oh, here's Black music, here's African-American music, here's indigenous music, and so on and so forth. It's important to recognize that these other people, these people who have been traditionally othered, I should say, we're making music, we're making art, we're contributing at the same time as Palestina, as Mozart, as Bach, as Handel, as Vivaldi, as Schubert, so on and so forth. Some of them were doing it, and also to recognize too that some of these people were creating this music in that same style, or in that same sort of with that same sort of information, at Western information, and some were creating it from their own cultural spaces, and a combination of all any combinations of that. So what we're trying to do, myself and many of my colleagues, in different ventures that I'm a part of, I'm a co-founder of an ensemble called Early Music City, which is a progressive early music ensemble, which works to, again, say what, for one, focus on early music, but what is not just traditional early music, but what is early music of this city, of Nashville? What is Nashville's early music? What is America's early music? So talking about that. Then, of course, myself and Dr. Kendall have been producing a number of ventures, some of which you saw today, around, again, performing spirituals and Black music in proper context, with period instruments, myself with Early Music City, as well as Dr. Kendall and others. There is a particular project that I'm not going to share about that one actually at the moment, but because that's still in the work and I don't want anybody to take my ideas. It's very good. But again, it's very important that we look at, I'll say it like this. It's important also that even when we look at the music that we traditionally revere, how composers such as Mozart and Haydn were funded. You know, they were funded by these families, these elite families like the Esterházys and these estates and such. Well, ask also, where did that money come from? And you may find some ties, and I'm not saying particularly the Esterházys, but it could be, research, ask, dig.
I would add, Patrick, that Handel, one of our favorite composer of some of the greatest flute sonatas ever, owned shares in slave ships. So that's where some of his money came from.
And see, I was actually going to not say that because that ties to what I'm working on. But that's the point. But that is actually the point. So look at where these people got their money. Look at also where they got their influence. And also, once we do the scholarly study, it's important that we sort of break down and come to the humanity of it. So who all is affected? And what are if we're going to speak of Handel and we're going to speak of Bach and others, what are they saying? What is the music that they chose, or the text that they chose to set? What does that say to our human condition? Mm-hmm. How does that aid in and sometimes contradict to what they were doing, but aid in what we believe in as a human, as a human race? So yeah, those are just some thoughts. And there's some other projects I would just say to be on the lookout. Mm-hmm. Come the fall, so you see what's happening. But there's some good stuff being cooked up.
Well, I want to add Marquita to this conversation because one of the questions says, how can we continue to be advocates for promotion of this music in Nashville? And Marquita is the person who's directly related to promoting this music through the museum. And I'm certain that donations would be accepted with gladness. So Marquita, what else can we do to help in things like the museum, and how is the museum helping in outreach beyond the building?
One of the things that you can do is donate to the museum or become a member. Your donations and what you're paying when you become a member help us preserve our collections, and they also help our education and program departments, so we can continue to do outreach in the community and nationally, and continue to create curriculum through our programs. A few weeks ago, we just had one of our RISE programs where we invite teachers in to come in and help us write curriculum that we are hoping to put on a more social platform. And that way, it's not just in Nashville, we're sharing it first nationally and then globally. So that way we're helping spread and preserve the history and culture that way as well. So I would say becoming a member, donating to the museum, and also if you know of people, in the industry or people who are looking to have those stories preserved, especially within the Nashville community, send them our way. We want to start talking to them. We want to start developing more relationships with them so we can also start in the future having an oral history program here so that we're preserving and sharing those stories, not just in Nashville, but nationally and globally as well.
Okay. There's a question. Can you talk about the influence of African-American musicians in influencing movements in other countries? Certainly, I'm sure Patrick has something to say for that, but if we get even outside of classical music, you look at the biggest group going now, BTS from Korea, they're rapping, they're singing soul music, they're doing R&B, they're using Temptations dance movements. Korea and the United States of America, there you go. Right there is the influence that African-American musics have had globally. Virtually every popular music from every country outside this one is in some way, some major recognizable way associated with African-American musicians. So we are doing the diplomacy of this country.
I'd love to add to that too. Speaking of like BTS, but also there's a gospel group that BB Winans has recently started like really developing a great relationship with, called Korean Soul or Korea Soul. He even has had them on his records. But you know, so we're seeing how, and I think it's very, it's very, it's pretty easy to see, you know, how Black music, R&B, hip hop, soul, gospel, everything is sort of influential in all of these different countries. But as the question is stated, you know, how is this actually influencing these social movements? You will find that during, you know, we've seen during this past summer, 2020, and actually and beyond that, in other movements, there have been people fighting for their own justice and their own rights and such, who are singing some of the same freedom songs that were sung in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and so on and so forth. And they're adopting them for their spaces under the regimes that they're in. You have also seen, one example of this who was mentioned also in the presentation, Paul Robeson. Paul Robeson was really much a man of the world and was vilified in many ways by the country for his activism abroad. If I'm not mistaken, there is a mountain in Russia named for Paul Robeson because he was actually, you know, out there fighting just as much for them and singing their songs, singing the songs of the people who and their social movements as well. Understanding those like a Paul Robeson and the Marian Andersons and so many others, understanding again that human condition and saying, okay, if I'm singing "Oh Freedom" over here and you're singing about working in coal mines and having harsh conditions over here, something is happening where we're all experiencing some form, not the same, we're not going to equate it, and we're not going to, you know, play oppression Olympics, but something has happened where we're all experiencing oppression of some sort. And so in our humanity, we can aid in dismantling that. And I think, you know, lastly, yeah, that's pretty much it. And lastly, too, I would say, you know, we have seen, I'll use this as an example. The president of, the first president, if you will, of Ghana, came to the United States to study. He studied, and he has his degree from Lincoln University of Pennsylvania. I say that to say that all of them, and of course, Ghana doesn't receive its liberation. It's the first African nation to get its liberation. All of the conversations that are happening for African Americans and other communities of color, but particularly for African people across the globe, they're all happening. They're not happening within a silo. Everyone was in communication. Frederick Douglass is in communication with in his day was in communication with the folks of Haiti and with those in the West Indies and in Africa. Of course, you know, we have Marcus Garvey who's leading movements in a very Pan-Africanist way. So all of this is connected. Though we're asking about the music is connected to the conversation that's happening more broadly. So we have to really take those things into effect and account.
And I think there's there's a question here about, is there a balance in sharing Black music with others, but keeping it preserved and respected? This questioner says, I've seen some discourse about white artists joining genres that have been traditionally dominated by Black artists, like rap and R&B. I had an interesting experience. When I went back to get a degree in writing in New York, which is supposed to be the liberal capital of the world, boy, there were some people with some really backwards ideas. And one student, a white male student in one of my writing workshops, wrote a paper about how Macklemore, a white rapper, was the savior of rap. Now, fortunately, the professor for that particular workshop was Ben Ratliff, who is a former music critic for the New York Times. And then I was in that course, a musicologist. Now, why this guy thinks he should say anything about music with that kind of firepower in the room was amazing to me. We had some discussions and he was able to kind of retract that particular statement. Also a statement about saying that people did not dance to bebop. And I just simply said, I don't know any music on earth that Black people have made that they don't dance to. And as it turns out, at Columbia University, there's an archive of videos of people dancing in New York to bebop. So spreading the education is part of it. And in general, I have found that Black people are welcoming to anybody who wants to sing our styles of music. But what I personally resent, and I think many of us resent, is giving credit to people who did not create the music, or only accepting it if it's performed by people you find visually acceptable. That was certainly what was happening with Elvis Presley. He was singing what he learned in backwoods of Mississippi and Tennessee. And yes, he sang it, but he gave credit to the people he learned it from, but the United States as a whole was not always willing. And some of the Motown recordings, when they were sold in the South, they could be sold if the pictures of African Americans, the groups, were taken off the covers. So I think that is really the problem, deciding who gets credit for what. A doctoral student I'm working with now out of California is working on the credit, too much credit for the musical aspects of spirituals being given to European influence rather than to African influence, particularly the fact that Africa did know of Christianity at the time that spirituals were produced. So it's something about respect in the Aretha Franklin sense, RESPECT, that we want the respect given. And that's why I'm really glad to participate in the musicology part of it, because somebody who understands the balance of that respect needs to be part of telling the story. Now, this does not mean that I don't play Mozart anymore because I'm not a white Austrian. I do play Mozart. I love Mozart. But I do also value what people from Mozart's time said about Mozart's music, as I do value what I have to say about African-American music. I think it adds a flavor that we need to know about. I would like to ask Marquita, how do you deal with this in the museum? Because there are people white people in particular, who have made sizable and memorable and notable contributions to the spread of African-American music. A lot of the blues, for example, stayed lively because the Brits were just obsessed with it.
Yeah, and there's a section in our Crossroads gallery, our blues gallery, where we talk about that. We dig into it, but we also talk about who their influences were and who came before them. We trace it back and give credit where credit is due. Within each gallery, we have an interactive called Roots and Streams. And when you go in it, you're going to see artists of different, races there, and you may click on, Eric Clapton's name in that interactive. But once his name pops up, it's going to give you a list of everyone that he was influenced by, and you're going to have their biographies and their songs. It's a learning, teachable moment where you get to learn about the creators of, the genre in this music, and the people who influence them and people who influence them as well. It's a timeline that goes back, but also goes forward as well, because, it'll show you that person's influencers, that person's peers who was recording at the same time they were. And some of those people may, in the larger aspect of it, be unheard of, but they were there creating music at the same time. And then it's going to say, who did they influence as well? And you're able to actually save those songs and take them back home with you and create your own playlist. So you're learning at the same time. That's one way we deal with it. And we do get all those questions because we have a few pictures of Justin Timberlake in one of the galleries, but we put it into context and showcase him next to those Black men and women whose sounds influenced him. And we talk about that. We do get those questions walking through, like, why do you have a picture of Justin Timberlake and not this person? Like, well, Justin Timberlake played a role in pop music during this particular time, but we are talking about who his influences were and the sounds that he used and who created those sounds. So we're finding that it's hard, especially with so much square footage in a museum, to find that space. But the next thing for it is, if we can't put it on a panel, we're having a program about it. We're having a lecture about it. So that's how we're finding that balance to that.
Yeah, I think that it's one of the kind of interesting things. My most recent research project that I'm just getting started on is kind of working the other way around. I play flute, but I also play some of these earlier instruments, and one of them is a fife. And one of the pieces of research I did about 16th century French dance showed pictures of fife and drum players. They started in Switzerland, spread all over Europe. The British brought them to the United States, and then fife and drum corps became part of the United States experience. Okay, so far so good, all European. But then I found out that African Americans, or Africans at that time who were in America, and Native Americans were not allowed to have guns during some of the, not the Revolutionary War, but certainly the Civil War. So they let them be part of the fife and drum corps. So that already changes your notion of what a fife and drum corps is. Then the Africans, by then African Americans, left where the war zones were, came back home to southwestern Tennessee and northeastern Mississippi, and turned some of those fife and drum instruments, used them to a new style of blues. And I'm just finding out about this. And Nashville has had some celebrations of some of these fife and drum corps that play their own special subgenre of blues. It's an amazing thing because, you know, flute hasn't been that popular in blues. So now I can find my way into blues playing. I also found out that some of those fifers and drummers in the Caribbean formed their own music called tuk-tuk. So now we find that we take European music and turn it into something unique, give it our own influence. So the influence is not just going from Black people out, but it's coming from white people in. And I just think that's healthy and global. So it's just like kind of a fun thing to do.
I would love, there was a statement that I think that you said, Dr. Kendall, that I'm trying to recall, something in the form of, I think it was something to the effect of, you know, there's a lot of comments about how the spirituals being so influenced by European.
Yes.
And it made me think about particularly about this conversation that we have around Harry T. Burleigh and Anthony Dvorak. But there, and you know, Dvorak having, you know, and again, they were both influenced by each other, as Dr. Kendall has just said. There is an influence of both of these figures from each other, you know, student to teacher, and then and friends, and kind of sharing in this way. And part of the reason why I'm bringing this up, on another side, to point out, Antonín Dvorak was brought, a composer from the Czech Republic, a musician, a composer, a conductor from the Czech Republic, is brought to America to head the American Conservatory of Music. Like that, like just think about that. Somebody else is brought all the way over here to tell you how to get you to formulate the American musical landscape, particularly with Western classical music. How is that? And what Dvorak said was, yeah, the music that you're looking for that sound, it lies within the enslaved and it lies within the indigenous people. Yep. So like he just told, and they were like, and they didn't want to hear that, but it's like, no, this is it.
Well, he was also one of the only people at that level who would accept Black students. And that's why so many composers of Black classical music were influenced. He didn't try to influence them stylistically. He said, you don't need me. He was a nationalist. He believed you should get the music from your own culture, which is why he wrote music using Czech and Bohemian culture. He said American composers shouldn't go to Europe like all of them were doing at that time. They thought only Europe can produce art music. But he said, you know, go to the honky tonks, go to the church meetings, go to the camp meetings, go to the speakeasies, go to the places that play authentic American music, and there is your influence. And that was one of the most valuable things he did, not try to make them European, but to make Americans American.
Yes. And you know, and one of his other students was from Dvorak's work, the New World Symphony, you know, was a very famous Largo, which many of us know as Going Home. And one of his other students, William Arms Fisher, who was white, composed around that as an art song, a choral piece, a vocal piece, if you will. And I just had to find it because I found the quote so interesting for this period, for this day, that someone in an article said, an article quoted an anonymous reviewer saying, if we must have the Negro spirituals, by all means, let us have Fisher to arrange them. And so at that time, we're looking at we're looking at people not even wanting, for one, I think there's an issue that's often had, and I think this goes to some of that the conversation over the last question around, what becomes accessible or what not, or acceptable, what becomes deemed high art or high culture until someone else touches it. So, okay, we didn't want to see the spirituals from the actual people who created them, so William R. Fisher needs to do it. We don't want to have, and we can keep going on to this conversation, we don't want to see what they call now box braids, or what we know of as cornrows. We don't want to see that until, someone else puts them on. All of these things are within, again, they're all within conversation of each other. And so part of what we're looking for, and I was actually at a conference on this with some people with the Burleigh Society and others, and not just ensuring that Black musicians are recognized, but also that they and their families are properly compensated and are properly supported. So you can say so-and-so's name all day long. You can say I say Harry T. Burleigh. We have a festival in Tennessee State dedicated to Harry T. Burleigh. There are many institutions that are dedicated to Harry T. Burleigh and Florence Price and others. However, those families, and I know I have met descendants particularly of Harry T. Burleigh, are not receiving the benefits of Harry T. Burleigh's hard, long-fought work. So we have to really investigate how we equitably recognize these folks, not just, let's say their name. No, let's also ensure that they get what they deserve. Now, this doesn't at the same, and I know when people hear that, they think, well, then that's going to make that somebody else is not going to eat. I guarantee you, everybody's going to eat.
That's what Amber Ruffin said the other night on her show. Cut a dang check.
Just cut a check. You'll still have yours. You'll still have your food. You'll still have your checks. Just cut this, and so we can also establish and build. Because it is important that we have NAMAMs. It's important that we even also have, also in Nashville, is the Jefferson Street Sounds Museum. It's important that we support the institutions that are that harbor and that hold the traditions, that are also, if not built by African Americans, are led by African Americans, and also within other communal spaces. So if we're also going to have these conversations around other communities of color, let's ensure that we're not just, this is just, we're going to do this for the community. No, we're going to do this with them. That's the goal, is to do it in conjunction with, and in also ensuring that these communities are lead the way in what and how they want to see it be progressed, and how they want to see it be successful.
Well, we're getting down to the last few minutes, so if anyone has any additional questions, there was one humongous one that I don't think we have time to deal with about Black people in country music, which is something I would definitely be interested in talking about at some point. There is some influence there, especially in bluegrass, that's amazingly close to Africa that we often don't recognize. But I think now that country music seems to be opening up to more than Charlie Pride, then I think we have time to start spreading influence there and accepting influence and the connections there. I think that's going to be one of the healthiest things happening in music right now, because I've always loved bluegrass music, especially the early Dolly Parton. And I think, she has been interesting as an ally, because she had this Confederate dinner theater thing going on at Dollywood. And when somebody basically told her that wasn't a good idea, she stopped it just like that. You didn't have to tell her twice. So I think, talk to everybody, assume everybody has a positive motive until they prove otherwise, and then move on. But I thank all of you for being here. And Sharon, I'm sure you have some closing remarks.
Well, thank you so much. And hopefully this was enjoyable to everyone in our audience. We have 3 amazing scholars that were here today sharing their knowledge. As a lover of music, this was music to my ears. We're in Music City, so it's very important that we help those who are showing all aspects of Music City. So I thank all of you. Once again, I thank Regions Foundation, the sponsor for this series, for having the foresight to understand that these types of conversations our community really needs. So thank you very much and see you next month. Thank you.